Napoleon never conquered America. He never marched his armies across American soil. He never ruled a single American state. And yet, one of the most important decisions of his career would dramatically reshape the United States forever. In Europe, Napoleon was building an empire that seemed almost unstoppable. Across the Atlantic, a young American republic was expanding into a continent that still had enormous amounts of land beyond its control. To Americans, Napoleon was both fascinating and frightening, a revolutionary who had become an emperor. To Napoleon, America was something different. It was distant, young, strategically important, and potentially useful in his struggle against Britain. Then, in 1803, Napoleon made a decision that changed American history. He sold Louisiana, not a small territory, not a single city, an enormous piece of North America, to Louisiana. Purchase suddenly transformed the United States into a much larger continental power. But why did Napoleon sell it? What did Americans actually think about the French emperor? And why did a war raging thousands of miles away in Europe help create one of the biggest territorial expansions in American history? To understand the answer, we have to go back to the beginning. At the end of the 18th century, America was still a young nation. The United States had declared independence from Britain in 1776, the Revolutionary. War had ended with American victory. By the 1790s, the new republic was trying to establish itself in a world dominated by European empires. Across the Atlantic, France was experiencing its own revolution. The French Revolution began in 1789 and shattered the old political order. At first, many Americans sympathized with the French Revolutionary because France had supported the American Revolution against Britain. The two countries had fought on the same side, and many Americans viewed France as an important partner in the struggle against European monarchy. But the French Revolution soon became much more complicated. Political violence spread, the monarchy collapsed, and France entered years of war with other European powers. Then a young military officer began rising through the ranks. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's military victories transformed him into one of the most powerful figures in Europe. By 1799, he had taken control of the French government, and in 1804, he would crown himself Emperor of the French for Americans. Napoleon presented a strange contradiction. He had emerged from a revolution that claimed to destroy the old aristocratic order, but he was now building his own empire. The American Republic was based on Republican government. Napoleon was creating centralized imperial power, yet the relationship between France and America remained important. There was another issue that mattered even more. Louisiana. France had regained control of Louisiana from Spain in 1800. Napoleon had enormous ambitions for the territory. Louisiana was not simply valuable because of its land. Its position along the Mississippi River and around New Orleans gave whoever controlled it enormous strategic influence over the interior of North America. For Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains, access to the Mississippi River was essential. Farmers needed the river system to transport their crops. New Orleans was the gateway through which much of that trade passed. If a powerful European empire controlled the region, American leaders feared that the United States could eventually face a serious strategic threat. President Thomas Jefferson understood the danger. America wanted access to New Orleans, but Napoleon had plans that went far beyond the Mississippi. He hoped to rebuild French influence in the Americas. And one of the most important parts of that strategy involved the Caribbean. France's colony of Saint-Domingue in particular was enormously important, but Napoleon's attempt to restore French control there would face a devastating challenge. A massive slave revolt had transformed Saint-Domingue. French forces were sent to regain control. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance, disease, and a revolutionary movement that eventually produced the independent nation of Haiti. The failure of Napoleon's Caribbean ambitions changed his calculations. Without Saint-Domingue as a powerful French base, maintaining a large French presence in North America became far more difficult. At the same time, Napoleon was preparing for another enormous struggle in Europe. Britain remained France's greatest rival. The European wars required soldiers, ships, weapons, and enormous financial resources. Napoleon needed resources for his European ambitions. Louisiana was thousands of miles away, and the United States was growing stronger. The strategic value of Louisiana to France was beginning to look very different. Then American diplomats arrived with a relatively simple objective. They wanted New Orleans, but Napoleon was prepared to offer something far larger. The entire Louisiana territory. In 1803, the United States agreed to purchase the territory from France. The price was approximately $15 million. The deal transformed the map of North America. The United States had suddenly acquired an enormous amount of territory west of the Mississippi. For Americans, it was a stunning opportunity. For Napoleon, it was something else. A strategic calculation. France could not easily defend Louisiana against Britain. The territory could provide money for Napoleon's European ambitions, and by selling Louisiana to the United States, Napoleon could also strengthen a potential American counterweight to British power. The man who wanted to dominate Europe had just made a decision that would help reshape the future of North America. But the story was far from over, because Americans were not simply watching Napoleon from a distance. They were beginning to debate what his rise actually meant for the future of the world. And those opinions would become increasingly divided. To many Americans, Napoleon was one of the most fascinating figures of his age. Newspapers followed his military victories. His campaigns dominated European politics. His name appeared in American political debates, but Americans did not agree on what Napoleon represented. Some admired his ability to rise from the chaos of revolution and become one of Europe's most powerful leaders. Others saw something much darker. They believed Napoleon had taken the language of revolution and transformed it into personal dictatorship. This created an important political debate inside the United States. The country itself was divided between competing visions of foreign policy. Some Americans sympathized with France. Others believed Britain was the more reliable partner. And America's leaders were constantly trying to avoid being dragged into European wars. President Thomas Jefferson strongly valued American independence from European conflicts, but neutrality was becoming increasingly difficult. Britain and France were fighting for control of Europe. Both powers interfered with American commerce. American ships could become victims of European naval warfare, and American merchants were caught between two competing empires. Napoleon's continental system was designed to weaken Britain economically by restricting British trade with Europe. Britain responded with its own restrictions and naval policies. American ships were caught in the middle. The result was growing tension. The United States wanted to trade. Britain and France wanted to control trade. And Napoleon's war against Britain increasingly affected American interests. At the same time, Napoleon's image continued to evolve. He was no longer simply the young general who had emerged from the French Revolution. He was now an emperor. He had conquered or dominated large parts of Europe. He had reorganized governments. He had created the Napoleonic Code. He had built an enormous military machine. And to some Americans, his transformation was a warning. The American Republic had been founded on opposition to concentrated political power. Napoleon appeared to represent the opposite direction, but there was also admiration. His military achievements were extraordinary. His rise was dramatic. And his ability to defeat some of Europe's most powerful armies made him one of the most famous men alive. The American public therefore viewed Napoleon through competing lenses. To some, he was a genius. To others, a tyrant. To some, the defender of revolutionary France. To others, the destroyer of the very ideals that had inspired the revolution. Meanwhile, the consequences of Napoleon's policies continued to affect America. The Louisiana Purchase had opened enormous possibilities for America. Settlers moved farther west. The Mississippi River became increasingly important to the expanding republic. And the territory acquired from France would eventually become the foundation for the expansion of the United States across the continent. Napoleon had never intended to build the United States, but his decision had helped create the conditions for American expansion on an extraordinary scale. Then came another major development. Napoleon's war against Britain continued. British naval power remained formidable. The French emperor controlled much of continental Europe, but Britain remained difficult to defeat. The United States increasingly suffered from the economic consequences. American ships faced restrictions, trade was disrupted, and tensions with Britain eventually became severe. By 1812, the United States went to war with Britain. Napoleon was still fighting his own massive European war. The conflicts were separate, but they were connected by the same struggle for power, trade, and control of the Atlantic world. For Americans, Napoleon was no longer simply a distant European figure. His decisions had helped reshape America's territory. His war with Britain had affected American commerce, and the wider European conflict was influencing America's own foreign policy. But Napoleon's greatest mistake was still ahead. In 1812, he invaded Russia. The campaign began with one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen, but the Russian campaign became catastrophic. Distance, weather, disease, supply problems, and relentless Russian resistance devastated Napoleon's army. The retreat from Russia destroyed much of the military power that had made Napoleon appear almost unstoppable. Europe began turning against him, and the balance of power started shifting. The emperor who had once dominated the continent was now fighting simply to survive. For Americans watching from across the Atlantic, Napoleon's image was changing once again. The seemingly unstoppable emperor was no longer unstoppable, and his empire was beginning to collapse. After the disaster in Russia, Napoleon's enemies became increasingly confident. Britain continued the war. Russia advanced westward. Prussia joined the struggle. Austria returned to the conflict, and Napoleon faced a growing coalition of European powers. His military talent remained extraordinary, but France could no longer easily replace the enormous losses suffered during years of war. The coalition armies pushed toward France. In 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba. For a brief moment, Europe seemed to have escaped the Napoleonic era, but Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he returned to France. The event became known as the 100 Days. European powers immediately prepared to stop him. Napoleon gathered an army. His final campaign began, and then came Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon's forces were defeated by the Allied army commanded by the Duke of Wellington. With Prussian forces playing a crucial role, this time there would be no return. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. There, far from Europe and far from America, the emperor spent the final years of his life. He died in 1821, but his influence did not disappear. The Napoleonic era had transformed Europe. It had changed laws, governments, military organization, nationalism, and the balance of power. But it had also indirectly affected the United States in one of the most significant ways imaginable. The Louisiana Purchase had given America access to an enormous territory. The United States was no longer simply a young Atlantic republic. It was becoming a continental power. The expansion created opportunities for settlement, agriculture, trade, and political growth. It also created enormous conflicts over native American lands and the future expansion of slavery. So Napoleon's decision had consequences far beyond anything he could have fully predicted. Meanwhile, Americans continued debating Napoleon's legacy. His image became increasingly complicated. The emperor who had once terrified Europe became a historical figure surrounded by fascination and controversy. Some Americans admired his military genius. Others remembered his authoritarian rule. Some saw him as a symbol of revolutionary ambition. Others saw him as proof of how revolutions could produce new forms of dictatorship. And there was another important irony. Napoleon had spent years fighting Britain. The United States had also fought Britain, yet America and Napoleon were never true allies, in the way the French and Americans had been during the American Revolution. Their interests sometimes overlapped, their governments sometimes cooperated. But their political systems and strategic goals were very different. Napoleon wanted European dominance. The United States wanted to protect its independence and expand its influence across North America. The two visions were never the same, and eventually Napoleon disappeared from the political stage, but the United States continued expanding. The territory purchased from France became increasingly important. American power grew, and the balance of power in North America shifted permanently. The young republic had benefited enormously from a decision made by a French emperor who was primarily concerned with his own war in Europe, and that raises one of the most fascinating questions of all. Did Napoleon understand what he had actually given the United States? Napoleon never saw the United States become the global superpower it would eventually become. He died in 1821. At that time, America was still a young republic. Its population was growing. Its territory was expanding, but it was nowhere near the industrial and military power it would become generations later. Napoleon could not have known how dramatically the Louisiana Purchase would transform North America. The territory would eventually contribute to the growth of numerous American states. The Mississippi River system would become central to the nation's economy, and the expansion westward would help establish the United States as a continental power. But the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase was complicated. Expansion brought economic opportunity. It also brought conflict. Native American nations faced increasing pressure as American settlers moved west, and the expansion intensified the political struggle over slavery. The question of whether slavery would spread into the new territories would eventually contribute to one of the greatest political crises in American history. So the consequences of Napoleon's decision reached far beyond his own lifetime. Meanwhile, the image of Napoleon continued to evolve in America. Americans remembered him as a military genius. As an emperor. As a revolutionary who had become an autocrat. And as the European leader whose decision helped double the territorial size of the United States. His story became part of the broader American fascination with power and ambition. Napoleon represented something America both admired and feared: the ability of one individual to rise from obscurity and reshape an entire continent, but also the danger of concentrating enormous power in one person's hands. And this is where the story becomes especially interesting. Napoleon and the American Republic were almost opposites. Napoleon built an empire through military conquest and centralized authority. The United States built its political system around republican institutions. Napoleon sought dominance in Europe. America sought independence from European interference. Yet their histories became connected by one extraordinary transaction: the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon needed resources. France faced the threat of Britain. His Caribbean strategy had failed. Louisiana was difficult to defend, and America was willing to pay. The result was one of the most consequential land purchases in history. For Napoleon, it was a strategic decision made during a European war. For America, it became a turning point. That is perhaps the greatest irony of the entire story. Napoleon was fighting to reshape Europe, but one of his most important decisions helped reshape America. And Americans were watching him from thousands of miles away, trying to understand whether he was the defender of revolutionary ideals. Or the man who had transformed revolution into empire. In the end, both sides saw each other through the lens of their own ambitions. Napoleon saw America as a young and distant power that could become useful in the global struggle against Britain. Americans saw Napoleon as a fascinating but dangerous figure whose rise demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of political power. Neither side fully understood what the future would bring. Napoleon would die in exile. His empire would disappear.